Today we are speaking with Mr. Nader Majd, an economist formerly with the World Bank, regarding the impact of sanctions on Iranian people. Mr. Majd, thank you for being here and generously sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you
It is
very
our
much.
pleasure. So if you don't mind, I'm going to start with my first question. Mr. Majd, as a result of these sanctions, what medicines and medical supplies are becoming unavailable to people, and how this has affected them and their loved ones, especially during the pandemic?
Let me start with the sanction, which started sometime in 1979 after the revolution, and it's been affecting the economy across the board, all aspects of the economy. With a short break in 2015, when Obama in the JCPOA, they lifted some of the sanctions. There was a very short period that Iran enjoyed, some growth rates and improvement in exports and imports. But that was very short-lived because in 2018, President Trump put a draconian sanctions, covering all aspects of the Iranian economy, affecting exports, especially oil, imports, the growth rate of the GDP. And since then, unemployment increased drastically in the country. The real, the currency devalued. But now is more or less stable, but, affecting again the poor the most, because then you have import restrictions and currency devaluation, you're having a scarcity premium. And it's going to affect all categories of imports, especially exports are also affected, and oil and also metal industry export. It increased unemployment, increased inflation, and the impact on balance payments, and also the government deficit. These areas, they have been affected drastically. But specifically talking about the health sector, supposedly the medicine and drugs, all these humanitarian products are supposed to be exempt. But the problem is financing through the banking system. Since the Iranian institution and banks, there are 20 of them, including the central bank, they're all not having access to the foreign financing and trade, and also exchange. So although the humanitarian and health and medical products are not going to be affected, but because of that restriction, still, they cannot do transactions. All, drugs, we have shortage of them, especially the very vital ones for cancer, epilepsy, those. Yeah. And there are some companies in Iran, they produce, but, and somehow they import, but these are all lower qualities. And especially at the time of the pandemic, there were some 6 million Iranians, they were affected by this, and some 720,000 people died of the pandemic, not having access to many products like, ventilations, gowns, masks, and the clothes for the nurses and doctors and so on. So it was draconian, and it impacted the whole economy, specifically hurting the poor people in Iran. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that with me, and that kind of covered a couple of other questions that I have for you. But what services would you say are now less safe? We talked about healthcare and medicine. Besides that, as a result of these sanctions, what other services would you say have become less safe as a result of not being able to do international transactions?
It's food security, for example, the main objective of the sanction is to change the behavior of the government, or maybe regime change. This is not affecting. It's affecting, 80 million, 82 million Iranians, especially the poor, because of the inflation. The inflation hurts the poor much, much more than the higher, upper middle class and rich people. So nothing has changed the behavior of the government. Of course, they have problems of handling the management of the economy, but food security and pharmaceuticals supplies, and in the long run, it also, affected the health research, which was very important for Iran, because they had collaboration with various universities and entities outside Iran. Now that channel dried up completely, So in the long run, it's going to affect the health. But Iranians, they have a universal health system funded by the government. So that sector is also affected. That they have in the remote rural areas, they have all these clinics with practitioner nurses and so on. It's a good sense, but the system, but at the same time, not having access to medicine, okay, and supplies, medical supply, pharmaceutical supplies. So these these rural areas are also affected the most, especially at the time of the pandemic, the COVID.
Yeah. In fact, talking of the pandemic, how realizing that Iran is 80 million people, a very large country, how accurate are even the reports of the death that we hear as a result of pandemic? If people die in small villages, are they being reported, or is it it's even worse than we know of?
It's a very good question. The official statistics, they're not reliable, because there are many areas, as you mentioned correctly, the rural areas, remote areas. Correct. They're not going to be reported in the statistics. So the impact is much, much higher than the official figures.
Correct.
Yeah.
Talking of the safety, you mentioned about food safety and medicine, which is really critical, and it's something that affects most people. And I've heard about the fact that also in transportation, like Iran is operating some planes that have been in operation for 40 plus years, and they cannot get parts and all that. Besides that transportation, how is that affecting the industry as a whole? Because Iran is becoming a fairly industrial nation, but without that international connection, how is it impacting that sector?
The Iranians, these days they're using the Emirates and Qataris, Turkish planes for international flights. But you're right, the domestic flights are not safe because of the lack of parts for the planes, and it's very difficult. And also, there are secondary sanctions, and those countries, like in Europe, for instance, Switzerland wants to have, or Italy wants to have, or Germans. But the problem is, through the banking restrictions, they cannot have access to the things. Correct. So mostly the pressure put by the West on the Iran's economy, especially the US, Iranian economy is shifted to the East, to Asia. Mostly we're trading with China, India, Russia, and those countries, and plus, we have a lot of money, blocked by these sanctions we have, even in South Korea, India, and China. We cannot have access to our own money. It's a kind of robbery. Because the economy is suffering, and you cannot have access to your own money.
Yeah.
The product sold, a while ago, but the money is blocked in South Korea, for instance.
Correct.
So getting the parts, transportation, as you mentioned, not only planes, but the others, they need parts like trains and so on. And so, as I said, the whole, the macroeconomic, the whole economy is in a very bad situation. It's been 40 years. Of course, these sanctions, like in Cuba, for instance, it's been 70 years. Nothing happened in terms of the government or government change or behavior of the government. But whereas the people of Cuba suffered, Venezuela is the same. We are, before this Russian sanction, of course, Iran was the number one, in the world in the past 40 years. So in terms of the pharmaceutical, food, medicine, and all types of other humanitarian things, even the humanitarian things, they're not supposed to be banned, by US and even by Europe, by UN, but still because of the lack of financing and not having access to the market.
Correct.
All the things, even I remember that because we used to bring some cultural things to the US, like musical instruments, books, and all the things are also affected because of inflation, rising prices. And right now, the inflation is global, but it's going to be more severe in Iran, as I said, because of the scarcity.
Correct. Yeah. I'm just kind of curious, when we talk about the Iranian money being held overseas, like in the case of South Korea, is it because Iran is cut off from SWIFT that the South Koreans cannot pay, or is it the political pressure on South Korea? In other words, if the South Koreans did not have the pressure of the US, would there be a way for them to pay, or because the system is cut off, they cannot pay?
It's both, it's both of them. It's both pressure, because they're going to be penalized, if they do trade with Iran. These countries are going to be penalized by the US. And given the big US market, they're not going to jeopardize their trade, even China, and also SWIFT, as you mentioned, the exchange of currencies and not having access to US dollar, because US dollar is the global currency, and not having access to that system, the SWIFT system. Iran is not able even to do trade with the European countries, and South Korea, Asian, Japan,
Yeah. And would you say this cutoff from SWIFT is the primary reason that even medicine and other material that supposedly are not supposed to be sanctioned, but practically they are sanctioned because, in the absence of SWIFT, you can't really make any transactions?
Exactly. Okay. It's very limited. It's done, I don't know how they do it, it's very tricky business because it's not official. They bring low quality medicine with very, very high prices, affecting the poor mostly, as I said, because they're not in the system, the SWIFT system and so on. So even though those countries want to send medicine and pharmaceutical products, things like that, not having access to how to finance, how to exchange the things, it's a very bad situation, honestly, it's, of course, Iran needs to do some, I know they have some mismanagement because of this they have limited resources, so they have to do prudent economic management in terms of the using resources effectively and efficiently, and eliminating corruption. And these things are exacerbating, the situation now.
Yeah.
So these are other problems on the part of the government and so on.
Exactly. If you don't mind, I was going to kind of switch gear and ask you a different kind of question, and that is how these sanctions have affected people's view of the US government and actually the prospect of improving relations in the future.
Right now, there are tendencies. It's not impossible for the nuclear deal to get to something positive, because both the US and the Iranian government, both of them are willing to do something. But the question of sanctions, is there, because Iran wants first to get rid of these sanctions, to start talking to the US. And at the same time, lifting these sanctions, they're going to take a long time, because they're going to go to Congress to be approved. It's not an easy task. And, so not only the sectors of the economy and institutions are sanctioned, banks are sanctioned, the individuals are sanctioned as well. Even Iranians living abroad, they're having hard time to send money or to receive money these days.
Correct.
As far as the attitude of the Iranians toward the West and so on, that in Iran, maybe Iranians like the West. They're among the countries that like the West the most, even though, because of this hardship, there are sectors of the economy, people that they don't like, the West, but that's not the whole society. Iranians generally like to have a business with the West, and they know that, if this relationship is back, so this country is going, prosperity, is going to be enhanced in Iran over a very short period of time. People are hoping that, some avenues are open, so that, they can have relationship with the West, the European countries, and US. But generally speaking, it's mixed. The Iranian attitude toward the West is mixed, because they don't trust at the same time China and Russia and those guys, at the same time. They don't trust them.
It's being in a tough spot, because, as you said, historically, they have not trusted Russia and China. And then after Trump's actions, one would question, how can they trust the United States either? So.
Exactly. The credibility of the US is diminished drastically in Iran, Because of course you have the government propaganda machine there talking about US and the West and so on.
Exactly.
And I think it's not only the nuclear, it's, if they get to agreement for the nuclear, issue, there are millions of other issues that they want to bring it up. Get rid of all your missiles, all your weaponry, drones, and it's not possible for a country to get rid of the armaments. And what happened at the time of revolution, the Iraqis, attacked Iran, and Iran didn't have anything at that time, So they don't want to repeat the same mistake. So asking such a, demanding such a thing from the government of Iran to get rid of the missiles and defensive, weapons and so on, it's not realistic.
It's not serious. Exactly.
It's not realistic. Any country need to defend itself.
And from what I don't know the exact numbers, but I hear that the budget that Iranians allocate to their military is just a fraction of what, say, Saudi Arabia and UAE and these countries are spending on their military. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
It's manufactured basically in Iran. We have, fortunately, even because of these sanctions, we have very, very educated civil servants in Iran, and also very educated young people in all areas.
Correct.
And I witnessed, in different areas of the economy that because of the pressure, they're becoming more self-sufficient. It's not ideal, like, I was visiting a gas production facility in Shiraz. And these young people, they were showing me that how they got the parts from all over the world, assembled them, and made Iran independent of importing the gas,
Yeah, that was a big
But
deal.
the problem, the guy was telling me, the young person, he was telling me that if something breaks, you're going to be in big, trouble, because it's not possible to replace it quickly.
Yeah.
So they are doing all the things, assembling, manufacturing, like drones and like even planes, they're doing missiles, they're doing. But the lack of parts, lacking, they're not having access to the parts still is a problem. But the young people, in Iran, they are very highly educated. And even my colleagues at the World Bank, when they visited Iran, they came back. They said, "Oh, Nader, let me tell you, compared to the other Middle Eastern countries, Iranians, even because of the revolution and sanctions, they have the best civil servants in the Middle East." Yeah, I worked myself in many of the Middle Eastern countries, especially the GCC countries, for 12 years. And if I compare, the Iranian civil servants are very educated, especially education is a priority for the families in Iran. They want to send their children to all universities, especially Sharif, Danishgah, Tehran, and those places. So it's a number one priority for every family. And this way, especially the girls, the women are participating more and more in all aspects of the Iranian economy.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I want to again switch to a different area. What about environment and like the air quality, water quality? How has sanctions affected that aspect of life in Iran?
Partly it's because of, again, sanctions are very important because the type of petroleum they use, the gas for the automobiles, they don't have access to imports of good quality gas for the cars. So they pollute all the cities, these cars, using the low quality, gasoline. So it's affecting, but at the same time, the management in Iran should take care of this issue. And they have tried in the past, but this is a global issue, the pollution and climate change, is the biggest problem today, threatening the whole planet.
Yeah.
But in Iran and even in China, India, those places, it's extremely bad situation, especially in Tehran,
Yeah.
Tehran, the air pollution is bad. As I said, again, the environment, you have to have access to high quality technological, products, the state of the art. And some of them are banned and they cannot have access to those.
Right.
Or air pollution, water pollution, and so on and so forth.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
My last question is there anything else you think the Iranians would like Americans to know about these sanctions?
I think it would be a good policy for the West, especially the US, to get rid of these sanctions, because the more pressure they put in Iran, they push the Iranians, towards Asia, because they don't have any other choice.
Yeah.
So China to be the power supply of goods and services in the world today. So the more they need petroleum, and we need technology and goods and services. So as you see that we are having more and more trade investment agreements with China, India, and those places, I think US and the West should stop these sanctions. It's not going to benefit anybody, the Europeans. It's a big market, Iran. Iran is a big market, highly educated people, middle class people with purchasing power. They can buy all these European goods, and if Germans want to do it, Italians, they're eager to do it. Spain, Switzerland, all these different countries, they want to establish relation, but because of the US pressure, these days they cannot do anything, So I think it's a good policy for the US, especially at this time, it's a good policy to get rid of these sanctions gradually, and this way, you're going to have 100% the support of the Iranians, I'm sure.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Mr. Majd, I want to thank you for your invaluable insights. I really appreciate the time and what you shared with us, and wish you a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks for your efforts, to enhance public's knowledge about all these issues, which are very critical these days. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.